I called my talk "What Makes the City Smart." It is a little bit on a play of this smart city, this idea that something is smart, and we do have a little bit this idea of we are, you know, like something is working much better, something is working much more in order, something is becoming more efficient. And basically what my whole approach to this is that we basically have to completely discard this idea for now, and also discard a bit the idea of that we know what makes the city smart, because of course there is a lot of ideas about algorithms and as a tool that we can use to you know, to make everything function for us in a much more sustainable and a much more efficient way. And that's something I want to challenge. I want to challenge it as part of this postdoc project. And I think I've always tried to challenge a little bit, even throughout my work, of what I've been doing before. Yeah, so I want to start with looking a little bit at the perspectives that we're having, different approaches to smart city from the different disciplines that I'm coming from. And then I want to talk about some of the case studies that, especially two of the projects that I've been working on that have brought me where I am right now, which is on the one hand the Uber study, where we have been studying Uber drivers, you know, the ride-sharing service, and how this app in itself has transformed labor. And then I will in the next part go also through how these things can be studied. And I want to show actually some data and some videos, and I want to show along this car studies that I've done, how these individual experiences can look like. That doesn't mean that it already kind of will answer everything that we would need to know about the individual experience, but it's a little bit of a kind of primer towards what I hope to achieve, or what I hope to gather in the future. And then in the fourth part, it's much more of a question, really, because I think in the end, it is a lot about finding a common language and finding a way of describing what is going on, and at the same time also not getting confused by each other's approaches, especially when we're working in this very multidisciplinary way. Well, so to start about thinking about perspectives, I want to actually start with my own perspective. I do have a PhD in HCI, and I've been always working with artifacts, with materiality. I've been always very interested in mundane technology, in like other people would maybe call boring. I've always been going around in the world, and you know, whenever something, you know, is part of people's everyday life, that's when I really start thinking about it, when I'm like, this is interesting. Why is this person doing this? Why is this person doing this? I will now, in the next 2 years, work on a postdoc under supervision of Rob Combes and Jonathan Metzger, both here. No, Rob is not here, but Jonathan is here. So it will be a combination between media and interaction design and ABE. I keep forgetting what the abbreviation stands for. Yeah, so it will be a combination between urban planning and MID and interaction design. And I think this is actually quite a difficult undertaking, much more difficult than I would think, because when I started reading about, I realized how the language, the kind of approaches, the way of thinking about the city, and the way of thinking about, also about digital technologies is very, very different in urban planning. It starts with that, just the way how papers are written, the way how subjects are chosen, how things are formulated is very different. And I think that's that kind of language, it's a different kind of language that is spoken there. And I think that is a big challenge, but at the same time also, you know, I like a good challenge. So I think this is actually where I see a lot of my work happening, in bridging that. And also maybe I do have a background in anthropology and cultural anthropology. So it is a little bit of a cultural clash I see there as well. And lastly, the reason the images that you see here, I have actually been taking where in the place where I'm coming from, because this project actually brings me personally full circle. I grew up in the Ruhr area, which is not the touristy part of Germany, one can say. So we have a lot of old industry there that is not running anymore, and the whole area has been struggling in the last decades, actually, in the last century, with restructuring, finding new ways. I mean, it has been very dependent on coal mining. I have myself a grandfather who was a coal miner, and my father is actually an urban planner. So I've grown up with this idea of how complex and how messy cities are, and how, well, unplannable almost to some extent they are. For a long time, I have been watching these transformation going on around me. And I think this is something now, being able to connect that to technology and thinking about it from this technology perspective, that is very, very intriguing to me. But let's talk a little bit about the two disciplines that I've been thinking around in the last years, and especially interaction design is something that doesn't engage with the smart city as much as one could imagine. Looking in the normal outlets for the smart city, for different approaches to urban planning, there is some literature, but it's mostly that the term itself, smart city, I think hasn't really found the kind of reflection. Instead, there is a lot of research going on that actually in some way or the other, in my opinion at least, would fit very well, even though it might not always be directly related to urban planning. So first and foremost, there's of course issues around civic engagement, and there is a lot of work in interaction design done around how we can involve people into the place and the spaces they're inhabiting. So there is a lot of work that uses different forms of design in order to foster that kind of engagement. But of course also to critically approach some of these things. We're talking about aspects of surveillance and security and privacy and so on. There is a really strong interest also in sustainability, of course. So ways of using technology to improve public transport, to impact people's behavior, to in terms of energy consumption. There is a lot of work on this in this part. And the work that I have been mostly engaging with in the last years is mobility. I am myself, and a lot of fellow researchers are very interested in personal mobility. There is, of course, a huge part within HCI that is focusing on the interface in the cars. So automobility, mainly done in terms of usability, in terms of safety. How does the interface have to be designed? But of course, most recently the last years with much more influence of topics around autonomous driving. Issues of transports are also becoming much more important. There's a lot of work on maps, how people are reading maps, how people are using different navigation systems. That actually goes long back. What all of these interaction design approaches have in common to some extent is that they're very much focusing on the user, as we call it. So the individual or groups of people that are interacting with technology, and how can we understand this interaction, and how can we design for this interaction. Now, looking instead into literature in urban planning, into the way how the smart city has been understood within urban planning, and of course also lots of neighboring disciplines. The first term that I was not familiar with, but I was very intrigued by, is this term of urban cybernetics, which actually already emerged in the 1970s. And I think this kind of set the tone for how urban planning, the discipline, talks about the city and the smart city, and the role of computing, of technology in the smart city, because it is very much seen as a kind of tool for planners, for policymakers, to understand the city, to use algorithms as a toolbox to steer, to control. Yeah, that's basically the idea that is behind it. And whenever we're talking about the smart city, that is this very top-down process that comes through. And this, of course, will then, go also towards policy organization. When we're looking towards organizational studies and business studies, we have a lot of ideas around that as well. Of course, there's also critique. It has been called, as I said before, it has been called ill-defined. It has been called utopian. It has been called a neoliberal project that doesn't really take into account, the personal needs and so on. But overall, the idea of the smart city is a very top-down idea. So just to give you some more idea, a city is smart if it provides better efficiency for urban planning through a variety of technologies. That's a smart city. Townsend goes a little bit, formulates it maybe a bit more refined, or obviously a bit less just in terms of tools, and takes into account that we have a lot of bodies, everyday objects, and a lot of different kinds of problems that we have to address. And in a more critical tone, this idea of that the smart city is technologically mediated practices of management. And so this is something that I was struggling with to some sense, because for me, as a citizen, moving through the city, being observant of what is going on, looking into the things that I'm interested in my research, I don't see this kind of smart city. I know it is somewhere there. I know I'm probably, or people are probably experiencing the effects of this kind of thinking. But from an interaction design perspective, I can't help but think, but how does the smart city actually know what is going on in the individual experience of their citizens? How can we manage the city? How can we think, address social, economic, and environmental problems, as Townsend formulated, without knowing how whatever we're doing is experienced, is perceived, is actually there where the city is, where the people are. And I think it's interesting because I also see that this is some approach that is very much focused on the background I'm coming from. It's very much focused on this user-centered perspective that I've been working with for the past decade. And so I wanna start this by, or I wanna give a little bit of an example for how these kind of experience can look like. how algorithms are actually experienced in a particular case here, which is the case of Uber. We conducted the Uber study, which we focused around labor in 2013. So that was the time when Uber basically just had started in running in Sweden. And we interviewed taxi drivers, Uber drivers, and passengers in London and San Francisco. So in San Francisco, it was already quite established. I mean, that's where it had started. In London, it just started to take over. And what we did in the study is that me and my colleague did the data collection in London. I did the data collection in San Francisco. We would call an Uber on our phone, or we would actually hail a cab, or order a cab in some way, and then we would sit together with the driver, and obviously they would have get some incentive, and then we would do a rather unstructured or semi-structured interview where we would basically go through a bunch of different issues or a bunch of different things that we saw, but we were very much also basing our interviews on the experience, on the practices that we could observe right there. And I want to underline that it was actually really important to do it there in the cab, in the Uber car, because it helped the drivers to really feel themselves in the situation. And that's actually why this current situation obviously is very far from ideal, because not having interviews, not having this kind of data collection situated in the situation is quite a challenge to really get the kind of ideas, the kind of emotions, the kind of experiences that go through these drivers in this example had. And so the big thing that we could observe was these changes that were happening on very different levels. And I think when we're thinking of Uber in terms of urban planning, when we're thinking, we obviously can see that Uber has brought with it huge transformation in terms of policies, in terms of mobility. And I'm sure I know that when you're looking at data, when you're looking at the big data around mobility, around personal mobility, of course, it will tell us something about how there's different patterns now in the way how people are using taxis, for example, or other kind of personal mobility. However, what you can't see from that data is these really rich experiences, the rich kind of underlying social and cultural changes that came along with Uber, and with similar transformations as part of it. It's not just Uber, it's obviously other taxi companies have started their app as well. And of course there's this whole economy now, the whole app economy that has been emerging. I don't want to go too deep into this. And of course it has been also seen much more critical recently. But in the data, in those interviews, it just was very, very interesting to see. It was very intriguing to see like the relationship to passengers, the way how the drivers were thinking about passengers differed massively between the taxi drivers and the Uber drivers. So here, the rating system that, if you have taken an Uber, you might be familiar with that you, after you have taken a ride, you can rate your driver from 1 to 5 stars. And the drivers are actually, if they're not fulfilling a certain average rating, they're actually, which is quite strict, I think they have, depending on the location, they have to have at least 4.5 or even 4.7 stars on average, otherwise they're not allowed to drive anymore. And so these stars, the kind of having to engage with the customer, though this was a very, very strong theme. And it really, really changed the way how Uber drivers were thinking about, you know, that, oh, we have to prepare water, we have to be careful to find good conversation topics, as opposed to, you know, just the taxi passengers getting in the back of the car and just, you know, everyone is just going their way. Because these stars could really, you know, affect your business. And so what we saw there was this emergence of emotional labor, you know, that it wasn't just about finding your way from A to B. It wasn't just knowing how to navigate. It was also about entertaining, or, you know, being emotionally engaged in some way, which obviously can be quite harrowing. Of course, there were also massive transformations, and I think this is also really interesting in terms of maps, in terms of the role of satellite navigation. Again, we are talking here about an industry, the cab industry is quite old, and in London, this is a quote that you see here, many times in recent years, sat navs have gone against the black cab drivers in London. They've never been able to beat us. You have to know that in London, in order to get a taxi license, you have to study a whole, it's actually a whole book that is called the knowledge, and you have to pass a test, and it requires years and years of study, and it's really, really hard. And there's actually been research that it actually even transforms the brain structure to some extent, because these drivers have to have such a good understanding of how to get from one point to the other in London. And if you have been ever driving in London, you know what a challenge that is. If you haven't driven in London, I would not recommend it, I can say that. So here we have this really strong transformation in skills, in training. It's a huge shift, and it really plays such a huge role in this everyday life reality. And of course, it also has a great effect on employment, on job security. I'm sure you have followed debates around this. It has been seen quite critical. Back then, Uber drivers, especially in San Francisco, really enjoyed that they had the flexibility. Of course, now in the current situation, I guess that flexibility might not be as welcomed anymore. Yeah, and of course we have the similar, we were also looking at passengers, and this is a bit of the passenger perspective, because I think there is also these changes of personal mobility, which I have been increasingly interested in, the way how people are getting from A to B. And taking a ride sharing service is a big role in that. Using an app to get home instead of taking the tunnelbana, instead of having to rely on a night bus. It will change the way how people interact with the maps, how people interact with in the cityscape. Of course, I can't help but think, of course, that a lot of these things at the moment are really restricted, but I really, really hope that this is going to be over at one point. Then and also, yeah, I think this is I think was our most favorite quote from the whole study. It's this young woman who says that she's actually got a credit card. She was like an intern, and she said she had a credit card that's her parents, and she basically she said a lot of her friends, upper middle class, upper class, instead of getting her own car, they would actually get like a credit card for an Uber account. And because the parents say they feel much safer if the kids are actually, getting around by using an Uber instead of driving around their own car. And these are the kind of things that we can't know, we can't see from just this big data thing. And these are the kind of things that I think in the end of the day will matter for, policy decisions. It will matter for the way how municipalities plan traffic, the way how municipalities think about personal mobility. And I think that very many municipalities, planners, policymakers overlook this very often, that there is this whole, there's a very strong idea around, we have the policies and we have the policy making, and this will trickle down eventually and become an experience like this. So now I want to talk a little bit about, what I call here now car phenomenology. Because I want to show, I want to give some more concrete examples how this kind of personal experience, looks like, and how this kind of engagement is. I think these kind of data points show how important this kind of personal engagement also is. I have been working in the last, 2 years before, when was it? 2016 to 2018, I've been working together with Volvo Cars at Halmstad Högskolan on this HEAD project, which is a great acronym, Human Expectations and Experiences with Autonomous Driving. The story there was that Volvo Cars had developed or still in the process of developing their technology for autonomous driving. And Volvo is very much, their previous research or still is very much happening in the lab, right? So a lot of, they were focusing very much on safety, reaction times, looking at how fast people are reacting in certain situations. Let's say if a moose comes, or, when you have typical takeover situations in an autonomous car, which would be that, what happens when the car goes from autonomously driving and switches over to, and switches over to that the person has to take over. So these kind of things are very nicely tested in a lab setting. However, Volvo realized actually that if they really wanted to test this kind of autonomous driving, they needed a bit more than that, because it was it is so fundamentally different as an experience compared to, the kind of driving that has been around and that Volvo has been doing quite good with for the last decades. And so they were, of course, in particular interested in trust, and if people were going to trust autonomous driving and so on. And so we decided to focus on ethnographic accounts, and the study was funded by Vinnova. Here, what we wanted to do, and that's why I called it phenomenology, is because the method that we used, or that I used majorly, is I called a so-called drive along. So what would happen would be that I would visit people, and in this first stage, so what happened unfortunately in the project is that Volvo never, during my time that I was there, managed to actually put together this autonomous car as promised. So we focused on cars that had different kinds of autonomous functions. So we focused on things like autopilot in Tesla, lane assist, collision warnings, and so on. And here again, we have this problem that when I'm talking to someone, when I'm interviewing someone, and I ask them, how do you use your lane assist and so on, I'm not going to get good information. So I had to be there when they were driving. And at the same time, I was seeking to share the experience, to kind of, basically put myself in the same experience in order to be able to see what they're seeing. Because in the end, that is actually what makes you really understand and guide you through the issues that are coming up. So So I would actually get up very early in the morning, and I would join my informants, my respondents. I would join them for breakfast usually, and then I would go to work with them, and I would drive with them in a car. And sometimes, of course, these car drives were rather short. They were maybe only 15 minutes. Sometimes they were a bit longer. And as part of that, we would talk about a lot of different issues, and things would just come up during the ride. And even if you might think, oh, what can happen during a 15-minute ride, I can promise you a lot of things actually happening, because a lot of the things that when we're driving, and that's the big problem, they're happening, we're taking them so for granted. Driving is such an automated thing that we don't notice it. I mean, I remember that when I did the study, I also interviewed Tesla drivers, and that already had their Tesla for maybe a year or so. And for me, the Tesla was very new at that point. I had never driven one. And for me, the autonomous functions within the Tesla were really quite impressive. So sitting with those drivers, I would be like, so are you using the autonomous functions? And they would say, I guess, yeah, of course. But they were really confused about me even asking that, because of course they were using the autonomous functions. It had become so much ingrained in their daily interactions. So without, like, if I hadn't been there, I couldn't have seen or shared or even inquired about the actual experience that was there. And it was going way beyond just saying, do you trust it or do you not trust it? These videos are unfortunately in Swedish, but I just want to show one of them.
Ja, sån här kollisionsvarning.
Jaha,
men det är så att om du kommer för hastigt in på en bil bakifrån, då börjar den att blinka.
And I have to apologize, obviously, the camera, how I'm doing it is that I hold the camera often just so it doesn't become too obvious to the informant, and especially when it's more spontaneous, like this was actually. So he talks about he has been switching off the collision warning, and he talks about how he has his own strategy when he's overtaking, and he says that when that he accelerates already before swinging out in order to be faster, to save the time, especially when there's another car coming.
Okay.
Och när jag ligger här och ska tajma, jag är ju så koncentrerad på den här bilen och den bilen. Så när jag kommer här så kommer jag för fort emot.
And he says he's so focused.
Och så blinkar så här, och jag håller ju på att köra.
And he says he's so focused that actually this alarm, this collision warning, actually almost made him drive into the other car, because he just didn't expect it, and he has his own strategy. And in that moment, the algorithm interrupts that strategy and gets him out of his routine. And so actually he switched it off. He switched off the collision warning, and he says he thought it was really, really bad. So of course, it's especially those very critical moments when there is a moment of disruption that we can see. I also have to say, the reason why I'm taking videos, which I used to not do it, and ever since I did this project, I always have been taking videos, is that not just because they're much nicer to show in presentations, but also because you can see how car driving is very, like, a lot of my informants, like all of my informants, very often would use their whole body in order to explain things to me. They would use movements like this. They would do big kind of gestures in order to really to express the kind of experience, the kind of bodily perception of what was happening right there on the road. I mean, I can just, this is just another example that we see here. He's also really annoyed and he wants to show me how he's talking about how this parking help isn't helping him at all, and how he doesn't trust it, and how he always just uses the mirrors because he needs to really be very precise with the parking because he has a trailer. And then he gets really angry about it. He actually, at one point, he drives back and says, let me show you again, this doesn't work. I wanted to park. So he says, like, what's the use of this? I need to have, like, I need to look in the mirrors anyway. So, yeah, he was so engaged about this that he actually just, for me, you know, drove the car out again just to show me again how bad the system was. This is the kind of engagement I'm looking for. This is the kind of situations that are happening. They're not exceptional. I mean, I picked those two because, because I had them there, but also because, you know, they were like really angry about something. I always think that's really nice, especially the last guy. But these kind of experiences, these kind of moments are happening all the time. I don't have to, you know, before I start these kind of data collections, I'm always nervous. I'm always like, oh, what if nothing interesting is happening? And this never happens. There's always a ton of these things, especially when it comes to this interaction with technology, especially when it comes to these things that are based on these embodied, situated actions that we're doing every day. As I said in the beginning, I've always been very interested in the boring things, in the mundane things, the things that seem to be, uninteresting for many people, or truisms, as one person once said to me, because in the end, they're not boring. And here's the thing that, that's not what I wanted to do. That when it comes to the city and when it comes to urban space, what we have is actually, on the one hand, we have, you know, this is a detail plan. I didn't really know how to translate that, to be honest. I didn't find a good translation. Maybe someone from the Swedish group crowd can say what detail plan, detailed plan, like the kind of, you know, this is how they have a very clear language. There is, when we're looking at urban planning, when we're looking at the language that is used by policymakers, by urban planners, there is a language. There is a clear way of saying, this is, you know, we have numbers, we have statistics, we have our maps, our plannings of how we see the city. But when we're looking at the kind of experiences, at the kind of perceptions, these tapestries of individual everyday lives, we don't have a language for that, at least not one that is easily understood. I'm struggling. I'm sitting here and I'm trying to show you what I see when I'm with these people in the car, or when I'm, you know, with the Uber drivers in the car. And I think this is definitely something that I want to very much engage with in the next years, and I really hope to find people that would be willing to do that, to find a way of not just, basically it's two challenges here, because the first challenge is to translate these personal experiences that are actually in the end making the city smart, people interacting with different applications. This is how the city looks for a planner. Maybe someone, you know, who plans a particular area in Stockholm, for example, here. But for the resident, for the dweller in the city, this is not how the city looks like. The city looks like a tapestry, a very individual tapestry of different experiences. And a lot of these experiences are happening around algorithms, are happening around transport, personal mobilities, people that are driving autonomous, increasingly autonomous cars. Those experiences don't fit with these very unidimensional maps. So these are the challenges that I basically want to work on in the next 2 years, hopefully. If obviously a lot of this is because it is so much related to human experience, and I'm anyone who has any suggestions, I'm very, very happy. But to translate human experience in a way that it makes sense in some way, but without actually losing the complexity behind it. I also want to understand different understandings. And this is actually something that I've been starting now, which is that for me, urban planners in practice, policymakers in the municipalities, they are still quite a black box for me. And so I've actually will start to do a lot of, this is what I'm doing right now, is to start, I want to get a grasp for how do they understand human experience? Do they understand human experience? And how does it actually become part at the moment, right? And of course, build on all of that, then to create shared understandings, not just with policymakers, but also with other academics from other disciplines. Hopefully create some sort of interdisciplinary kind of understanding of this human experience as part of the smart city. Yeah, so nothing more than that. Thank you very much.